Oh, hi there, guys. Just want to pick up on a couple of depressing stories that have been in the news over the last couple of days. So, firstly, there was a story that nursing staff are facing significant racist abuse at work. And then there was a follow up story about social workers and foster carers also facing huge amounts of racist abuse. Now, the report in The Guardian outlines how racist incidents against nurses in the UK have surged by 55% in the last 3 years. So within the article, they describe an incident in which a patient, reportedly said to a nurse that they didn't want people like her treating them, and then they referred to them as a slave. And then in the second article about social workers and foster carers, they report on foster carers whose ethnicity differs from those of the children in their care, being accosted in the street, and then social workers going into homes and communities and being faced with extremely upsetting comments about their race and facing an environment in which there's unprecedented levels of racism. Now, in terms of analysis, I haven't seen it mentioned anywhere, but most public sector jobs, and particularly nursing and social work, they're done by women. So in nursing, women make up about 90% of the workforce, and in social work, the number is just over 80%. And I mention that because it was established last year after the riots that there was a sizable number of people who were engaging in overt acts of racism and violence on the streets, who were also domestic abusers at home. And it was reported that about 40% of the people arrested after the riots last year had previously been reported for domestic abuse. And I think this is a similar situation. Ultimately, people who abuse others due to the colour of their skin are cowards and they punch down. And that's their MO, and it always has been. In general, if you're a coward, you're not going to risk abusing a male worker. You don't know whether they can handle themselves. You can never be quite sure how that interaction is going to go. The safe bet is to abuse a female worker, safe in the knowledge that they aren't going to fight back. And that's why I mentioned the people here who were involved in the riots, who were also domestic abusers. The people abusing these workers, these nurses, these social workers, are the same group of people who were involved in the riots, who were also domestic abusers. If you had a Venn diagram of rioters, domestic abusers, and people who racially abuse nurses or social workers, then it's basically just one circle. So we need to recognise that there's now a very small minority of people out there who are emboldened to say and do things in public, which they might have always thought in private, but perhaps they would have held back from in public. And so I want to take this a little bit wide to think about why people might now think it's okay to wantonly abuse, public sector workers and people in public due to their race or the colour of their skin or perhaps their religion. Public discourse in this country is in the gutter, isn't it? It has been for a long time, amplified by X, Talk TV, GB News, amongst other media platforms, and then also amplified by politicians and talking heads. Just this week we had Reform MP Sarah Potchin saying the quiet bit out loud as she described how she hated seeing black and brown people on TV adverts. But what's slightly different now, I think, is that with the rise of reform, almost been a sort of call to arms or a call to action for people who are upset about migration and about the number of non-white people in the UK. So we've seen these marches over the summer, we've seen this flag campaign, we've seen constant protests outside hotels, and we saw the riots last summer. And I think all of that can really be boiled down to what I would call go home activism. And so, of course, in that context, people are going to be emboldened to actually tell people to go home or to belittle someone based on their skin colour if things are not going their way or if they find an easy target. Because that's the other side of the coin, which isn't mentioned here in these articles. Public services are really struggling because of austerity. And if you're an individual and you're seeing a nurse or a social worker, then I'm going to wager that the chances are that things are maybe not going that well for you and also that you need help. Now, if that help isn't what you expected, due to austerity having hollowed out our public services, then it stands to reason that you're going to feel angry or you're going to be upset about that. Of course, if the person in front of you then is not white and if you're angry, in the current context, what do we think the end result is going to be here? Well, we can see what the end result is, can't we, from these reports? People are going to be abusive, and when they're abusive, they're going to fall back on what they see and hear in the media. I think overall it's a really desperate situation. If you're a public sector worker, there are certain things you can do to protect yourselves. You can think about joining a trade union. You can perhaps talk to your employer about what steps they're taking to protect you. As Sean Connery said in The Untouchables, your number one goal is to go home from work alive. So always remember that, guys. And yeah, stay safe out there. Many thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.